Vervaeke channel, and it's one of many conversations about the religion that's not a religion, that sort of thing. And it seems like what's going on among theists and non-theists alike is that whether it's at the individual level or at the cultural level, after 300-400 years of high expectations around self-determination and self-sovereignty, there's a sense of fatigue or exasperation. And again, it could occur at the cultural level, certainly at the individual level. So just that movement of recognizing that I might not be sovereign unto myself is a pretty big deal, because that sets up the next movement that, in a sense, says, well, is there anything that can be sovereign over me? Or rather, according or through or by which I can become more fully myself, because I feel keenly that I'm very much tangled up in the environment, and I'm highly susceptible to becoming disoriented from one moment to the next. What the expression is, I don't do what I say I'm going to do, and I do what I don't want to do, that kind of thing. It doesn't take much to recognize that at an individual cultural level we're somewhat difficult creatures to manage. And so my question is, does the sacred, when we talk about the sacred, could that just be what it looks like when we relinquish all the psychology and notions around our self-sovereignty and our ability to govern what we hold most precious, which is our agency? And so when we move to entertain and allow in an earnest way something else to govern our agency, or to at least share our agency, it strikes me that might be what now we're getting into the religious frame, or the sense of sacred. So I got a mic off here, but in AA, it's not explicitly Christian, but it's deeply Christian or Christ haunted. And when you consider all the different things that you could permit to govern you, it could be money, it could be power, it could be, any number of spirits. The one experience that we've encountered, and sort of the unexpected surprise, is that the least of all the spirits, the most non-coercive, the one involving caritas or sacrificial love or agape, has marked us. And I don't know, having been marked in such a way, I don't know that we can settle for any lesser principality or zeitgeist. And so is it possible for a Christ-haunted culture to make that move to be under the auspices of caritas without being explicit? So, because Vervaeke uses agapic love, I think that the essence of Dialogos is something like that mutual and deeply reverent recognition. So anyway, I'm trying to flesh out, I'll back away, but I'm just trying to flesh out where that how do you constitute the sacred in a secular frame, because that's what the Vervaeke guys were talking about. They used the word ceremony, which is pretty darn close to ritual in terms of how they might convene, and would it be awkward and that kind of thing. Anyway, somewhere there's a question in there.
Oh, there's way more than a question there. It's the true terror of a question and answer session is when you know that the question that is offered is going to be far better than the answer you can give. So that you are so right, and you are right on it, and you are right on it in how many different ways and how many different conversations, and your question just spiders out over the whole thing. I took notes. I'm glad I recorded it, because I'll get a chance to then go back and listen to it again. Because just to begin to splash in the waters of that question a little bit. AA, Emil Durkheim, Mahatma Gandhi, definition of religion, the public bowings and kneelings, the response to the public bowings and kneelings versus the response to the public iconoclasm that's happening. Rene Girard, it all comes together. The religion that's not a religion. Yesterday I was listening to the Rebel Wisdom conversation with a guy who was on his silent retreat for the last 75 days over the pandemic, or at least the last 75 days that we've seen, and all the attention that's been given to him. Philip Reif, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, notes that one way to summarize his work is that the heart of religion is no. The heart of religion, and that's, so Emil Durkheim looks at the sacred and says the sacred is the thing around which the community forms. And in many cases that is a no. And it's the no that obviously every rebellion forms around. We're against the no, and O as no. And the crazy thing about Jesus is that Jesus manages to get right the yes and the no, which is almost always the ways. That's any kind of sin, if understood as action, what you do and don't do, is always surrounded by the yes and the no. What do you say yes to? What do you say no to? And so I'll just reread the notes that I took. The religion that's not a religion on Vervaeke's channel. What's going on among the theists and the non-theists alike, the individual or the cultural level? The sense of fatigue or exasperation among self-sovereignty. We long to worship something. Of course, Augustine says nothing can satisfy one who would not be satisfied with God. That's a paraphrase of Augustine. God is in some ways both the infinite yes and the infinite no. The infinite yes is played out in creation, in this creation that we as human beings look around and say, whoever designed this was irresponsible because he didn't put bumpers on. It's bowling with the gutters open. You didn't, put up the bumper guards when you bowl. So God is irresponsible in giving people agency that they use to maim and to kill and to rape and to destroy. God is too yes, and also God is too no. How dare God allow death and suffering and decay into this world that Genesis 1 says is good. There is fatigue as our power grows. It was painful to watch. I was watching the Netflix documentary on Jeffrey Epstein. I just started it, and it was just so difficult to watch Here's a guy who there's very little no in his life. And so how does he use his agency? By using the power he has of money and to lure young girls in for his to exploit them and to deeply harm them. And again, these are the reasons people bump into the problem of evil. And one way into the problem of evil is, well, God is too liberal with the sovereignty he affords us. Yeah. So it's a big deal, and so the fatigue and exasperation among the self-sovereignty, that's a big deal. It sets up the next move. We are difficult creatures to manage. What a great line. And what's interesting about that is that we have a sense, and Chesterton again gets this right, I think, in the second or third chapter of his book Heretics, that we can't. It's very difficult for us to articulate the good. Even the Bible struggles with metaphor. The lamb will lie down, or the lion will lie down with the lamb. They will neither harm nor destroy in all my holy mountain. The city foursquare, streets paved with gold. Where he will wipe away every tear from our eye. These are the biblical metaphors of what our hearts long for. But even in those biblical metaphors, we have a sense that the metaphor itself can't capture, and certainly does not exhaust, the far deeper reality that it is pointing to. And we have the sense that the language that you and I aspire to use falls far short of the thing that language is pointing to. It is ineffable. So back to your comments. What we call the sacred is what we relinquish, the ability to sacrifice. And I know I was paraphrasing you as I was taking notes. We allow something else to govern and share our agency. That's community. There's the longing for community that we are experiencing. And yesterday in the question and answer, Carlos asked about divorce. The longing for community and our failures in community are completely related to our inability to maintain marriages. Because marriages are, of course, in some ways the most binary of all communities. And there's just two people. And we've even front-loaded it in the modern space where we get to choose the person we get to choose the person, not our parents, which is probably a demotion because in many cases the parents are wiser than the individuals. Not always. It's you can make good arguments in both sides, but we get to choose the individual, and then we can't stay married. Well, what's that about? You hold a big party and you stand in front of a church and you promise in front of God and the friends and neighbors and whoever you called that you're going to love this person for the rest of your life, and then within a short amount of time you hate their guts to the point that if one person shows up dead, the police, the first assumption of the police is that's the other one. So what does that say about, and what does community require of us? So my friend Rod and his church down in Tucson, one of the things that they really try to practice is submission. And so theologically, Rod and his co-pastor Eric have some deep doctrinal disagreements about, one's Calvinist, the other's Arminian, one believes in infant baptism, the other believes in adult believer baptism, and they keep trying to submit to one another, but one of the things that you quickly learn in a situation like that, as you learn in a marriage, is that just having a submission rule doesn't quite get you there. What you both have to submit to is this other thing that you're pointing at. So what is that other thing? Is it the secret sacred self? Well, that doesn't work because that's individual. I mean, the obvious Christian answer is God, but, well, now you're just, kicking the can down the road. Okay, well, what is this God? And I think over the last 2 years, one of the blessings of this journey has been to get some greater clarity over God, and God number one and God number two, and the system of all systems and the person of all persons, and well, how do we know this God, and how can we know this God in actionable enough steps to follow this God? Yesterday, again, I got a question, which was just the most, is in some ways for many of us the question of all questions. How do I know when God is speaking to me, or how do I know which action is right? And of course, if you read Romans 1, the Apostle Paul says, we suppress, our rebellion suppresses the truth in our hearts, and so then we exchange the true communion with this God for all kinds of other substitutions, facsimiles, and that's what our hearts do. So, yeah, AA, my basically the beginning of AA, we acknowledge that my life is unworkable. Again, we have this sense that we know when things aren't working, but we don't know what does work, and so then we try things out, and the difficulty is that idols, some of the false things that we grab onto, these things are not just, it would be nice if we could just pick them up and recognize that they're false. No, we can't do that, because there's enough truth in them to be sticky, to trap us, and to bind us, and to hold us. And so, of course, AA talks about, so alcohol is one of those powers. And in almost every case, the more glory potential the thing has, the more power to bind it has. And so, alcohol is a deep one. So when you consider all the different things you permit to govern you, money, power, the unexpected surprise, that the non-coercive, that the non-coercive has marked us. Oh, that's good. I don't know that we can settle for any lesser principality or zeitgeist. Well, so again, I was listening to the Rebel Wisdom, the Rebel Wisdom talk with the guy who was doing a silent meditation for those 75 days. And when he comes out to articulate the summum bonum that he is working in his life, well, it's love. And I'm thinking, well, haven't we, and Rebel Wisdom, again, I listen to almost all of their videos. I deeply appreciate David, and I respect David, and I respect the work he's doing, but part of what I keep feeling from his channel is that they're scared of Jesus, and there's a lot of, I think, partly sort of as a post-traumatic stress reaction, the West is scared of Jesus, and so the spirituals but not religious they're trying to, okay, let's take the Buddha and let's see if we can, and I don't know Buddhism well enough, or let's take these other traditions and these other practices and let's see if we can find Jesus in them, and because we're going to try to modulate these things to address the corruption and the abuse and all of the stuff that they felt or suffered in the Christian, under the reign of Christendom. And all our Christendom reigns have corruption that sneak in. But so, okay, I'm going to be a Buddhist, but I'm really going to smuggle Jesus into my practice. But I can't say Jesus, because then all the other people with post-traumatic Jesus stress disorders react. And I listen to them and I think, okay, well, hey, I'm not going to be in any way coercive with you. God bless your practice and God bless your search. But obviously, as a Christian, yeah, you're working many paths. But as a Christian, I think that these paths are going to lead you to Jesus. And I find all over the place people, well, Christianity, definitely not. Jesus, probably not, or maybe not. But love, the non-coercive love, that's it. But, was it? Oh, that's a video I haven't made yet. So many videos don't get made. Or maybe I did make it. I don't know. It all blurs together. But, you look at... I was talking about... You look at 50 Shades of Grey. What's the... Yeah, I did make a video about it. It's C.S. Lewis, and it's the specific pleasure of the inferior. Look at... I don't want to get graphic but look at, between sexual partners, the desire to be ravished. We play around with things like bondage and domination when what we really want to do is be the bride of Christ and have him ravish us. And there's little, it was Douglas Murray in the Madness of Crowds, where, we have all of this, we make consent a god. And then we play around with, act like you're taking me without any consent. Why is that a deep fantasy for us? The tells are just all over the place of what we were made for. And again, back to Augustine, we were made for him. Well, why is it a him? Well, because, we're, me, a man with a penis, in this interaction, I'm the her. I'm the vulnerable party to the warrior, the king, the hunter, the man, and part of me deeply wishes to be taken by this God and to be loved and to be cherished. So it's the woman, it's the child, and non-coercive. See, and again, we're trying to get at it. He's the and again, as I said in that video, what do men and women do? So you have a huge man who's a bodybuilder and he's 6'5" and he's full of muscles and he practices multiple martial arts fighting, and he meets a 5'4" woman and she steals his heart, and in that Peugeot power that Mercury and Andrea talked about, she turns his head, and all of that power that he possesses, he can dominate any other man in the ring, and he sees her, and he's putty in her hands. What is that about? So, is her power non-coercive, or is it feminine? And we, because we're so occupied with the coercive, because it so often comes to hand, and in many ways because our culture is so masculinely out of balance, we don't see the power, even though it's all over the place. And so non-coercive gets there, but it's like all of our words, they fall short. So I don't know that I can settle for any lesser principality. Well, that's exactly right. That's the hunger of our hearts. Possible to be under the auspices of caritas without being explicit. Dialogos, mutual and deep recognition. How do you constitute the sacred in the secular frame? Miroslav Volf had a great tweet this morning that Twitter algorithm's getting better and better, and I used to be annoyed at some of the things that it would pull up in my notification that weren't technically direct notifications. Of course, Volf being over there at Yale is going to point to Trump, but you can point to the woke crowds as well, because in many ways Trump and the woke crowds are just mirror images of each other through a political mirror. Boy, that'll get me in trouble if I ever post this. With both sides. Miroslav Volf says some evangelicals think that public religious gestures, for example, Trump's holding the Bible, will halt secularization. They won't. They enact secularization. They put the sacred to profane use that's contrary to the character of the sacred. Now, that's a little far. I don't think this will get me in so much trouble with so many people. I don't know that Trump is that lost. I think he's deeply lost, but I don't that he's that lost. And I don't know that the bowing, chanting, worshiping crowds on their knees are that lost either. They're lost, but they're not that lost. So, yeah, the secular. What is the secular? Well, again, Tom Holland sort of flipped a switch in my head about the secular being the secular. I think the secular was just God's astoundingly sneaky evangelistic mode that is uber patient, and one day every knee will bow, and so before they bow to him, they bow to no one. There's the secular. And then you get all the way to the other end of the secular frame, and Bob Dylan is there strumming his guitar. You got to serve somebody. So yeah, that's where we're at. That's where we're at. And we are short-lived creatures and very impatient, and so we tend to mark time in our own little ways, but ancients were wiser than that, and maybe if we pay attention around us, we'll be wiser than that, and we will be able to finally relinquish and say to God, not my will, but yours be done. And which is, of course, Jesus in the garden. So, great question. I hope my answer does it justice.
Paul, just a quick follow-up.
Thanks, Paul. I always appreciate your exquisite ruminating.
That's about what it is. I'm sorry for all the ramble, but everybody, this is the Discord chat room is completely non-coercive. Anybody can leave the moment they want. Go ahead, Shari.
Well, just part of that question that I don't know if you actually got to.
Yeah.
That I'm really curious about is that Joe was asking was, what. So people, let's just put it in simple terms. Let's say people on the Vervaeke server are looking for a place to nudge up, like Joe said, against the sacred, right? Where is it that both theists and non-theists can do that? Where specifically do you think?
Well, clearly, I was just listening on my walk here to church, so I'm going to talk to Rafe Kelly next week.
Oh, cool.
And Vervaeke has a what does he call it? Voices with Vervaeke, something like that. All these pastoral alliterations. Vervaeke has a conversation with Rafe, which is really exquisite, and I'm just a few minutes into it, but it's really good. And, Rafe was talking about, right when I had to try to figure out how to use Discord again, or not Discord, but Discord and OBS, because I'm trying to record these and figure out. I'm trying to integrate these talks better into my channel, and so I'm playing around with the technology. But Rafe makes this comment, and he kind of nicely goes through his story and talks about, he comes to community, and well, how do we form community? And he notes all of these different ways in which community is formed, going on hikes together, basically doing things together. Time is, of course, the great former of community, and of course animosity. So people on the Vervaeke server are looking for a place to nudge up against the sacred. Well, So over the last part of the attempting to address, could it be that every devolution from Christendom is just another attempt to address the corruption that has set in? And so over the last 50, 75 years, we've had people leaving churches, but if you ask them, oh yeah, I'm still a Christian. Oh, okay. Well, what's the deal with the not going to church thing? I think about J.D. Vance's Meemaw. What's the deal with not going to church? Well, pastors are charlatans and takers. Yeah, they sure are. And they take money, and they take advantage in many different ways, and yeah, it's a real problem. The clerical abuse was a big deal in the Protestant Reformation too. So right away they reject community, but they've still perhaps got their marriage and their family, and so then they look for community in different ways, and they try to find it in different ways. But whenever you seek community, you are going to bump into the question of the sacred for that community. What will and won't be tolerated in this community? And just like children, when they're young will test the boundaries. Jordan Peterson talks about this well in his book. Children, when they're young, will test the boundaries because they need to know where they are. And people will do that in community as adults too. Well, if I say this, can I get away with it? If I do this, will anybody stop me? Where does the no come? And, again, in some ways, marriage is all about this, because what do people do in marriages? Well, if I go and buy my toys and we don't have enough money for that, will she say no? If I'm not gonna speculate on the female versions of this. If I sleep with someone else, will they still love me? On and on and on and on and on. And so their community is downhill from this. Community is downhill from our longing for God, because community is so filled with His image bearers. And that's why. And look at Dialogos. Look at what John is doing. Look at the circling that guy Sangstock is doing. What are the words that we are using are not being uttered in empty halls. We're putting them out on YouTube. Journaling is a really weird thing because we're writing to no one. Well, are we? Who are we writing to? So I don't know if that's barking up the tree you're pointing to, Shari, but I think community has everything to do with it, because it's in community that we have a real-time exploration of the no and the yes, surrounded by other image bearers of the one our hearts long to finally be reconciled to.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Maybe we could move on to one of the questions in the chat.
Okay.
It's a question from Rickard. Angels and demons seem to have many different forms. Sometimes they seem to have their own bodies. Sometimes they're more abstract. Work as punishment and work as a meaningful activity that brings order to one's life. What are your thoughts?
Are those two questions? I'm looking for it in the chat. If I can. Okay. Yeah, I found it. Yep. I got it. See, again, I'm trying to figure out how to integrate these into my channel better. Okay. This is exactly the kind of thing I always get nervous about question and answer because the questions are so good. Angels and demons seem to have many different forms. Yeah, they sure do. Sometimes they seem to have their own bodies. Yeah, they do. First of all, sometimes angels and demons. See, this is where the people who are scared of Jesus and scared of the Bible, this is where they get triggered so easily. And that is a fragility that some of them don't overcome. And what's so funny is that they, as I think we all do this, we try to masquerade our fragilities as strengths, which is perhaps one way to summarize the whole new atheist movement. But yeah, and if you go back to the question and answer, see, this is why I record them, because I can refer to what I did yesterday. I'll have to post it. If you go back to the session we did yesterday, my thinking about principalities and powers and angels and demons have been deeply shaped by the work that I've done over the last 2 years and Jonathan Peugeot. And let me say it this way. Angels and demons haven't gotten any less real. They've gotten more real. Because within our modernist frame, we have an anxiety in the conservative side of the church that people are always going to be leaking over to modernism, and that concern is well-founded. And so you get questions that try to get at the problems, like the great question that was asked of Jordan Peterson at the Lafayette College. No, it wasn't at Lafayette. It was at a biblical series, where, if would God still be there if all human beings were gone? And that gets at the question of whether the divine is merely a mental construct, and that gets at the question of what is foundational and what is derivative. And the assertion there is that physicality is foundational and ideas are dependent upon that foundation. And I think this is exactly the place we're seeing the death of the new atheists, when you have Daniel Dennett on Unbelievable saying there's matter and there's information, and it's like, yeah, you're not an atheist anymore. You may be a non-theist, but you're not an atheist, because this, and I think this is very much where one of the things I've learned from John Vervaeke. Okay, so what's the difference between an atheist and a non-theist? Well, an atheist is sort of a thoroughgoing materialist that imagines that all these thoughts and ideas are dependent on our minds. And increasingly, the scientists are becoming more and more persuaded that the information forms the things that we experience as laws of physics. So now you begin to have you begin to realize the ancient terror that, well, and again, this is the bias, this is the line that, because as I go through this stuff, I want to know, okay, where are the lines? Well, here's the line. We cannot acknowledge any agency greater than ourselves to which we are subject. Any conscious, purposive agency greater than ourselves to which we are, to which we will forcibly submit. That's death in many ways. But which we potentially can voluntarily submit and ought to voluntarily submit. Well, now we're really barking up the theist tree, and that's the great terror, because again, you go back to Eric Weinstein's, the problem with God is that once you have a God, you have to worry about what's on his mind, what he thinks about you. Yeah, that's the great terror. So, and if now we're going to get into the thing that missionaries noticed when they began to become aware of their own secularity and the lack of secularity among the people that they were trying to evangelize. Well, all of our stories imagine that there are other principalities and powers and agents in the world. And of course, modernity, with great success, wiped away many of these and saying, sometimes these are just figments of our imagination, and sometimes we created Uncle Sam. He might not be fully subject to us, which we're currently seeing played out in politics, but Uncle Sam is a principality to which we can, in some ways, imagine our own authorship of. So we get some credit for Uncle Sam. Good. We don't really wield him, just like the spirit of the Kennedy Cougars or the McClatchy Lions, but it's there. So, but the problem is, again, once you open that door, then you have to ask yourself, and in some ways, the movie series The Matrix had some of this, because if you remember is it the Merovingian? So you had all these leftover spirits who were elements of past code that were still lingering in the Matrix, and even Neo struggles with some of these creatures and their walls and their constructs as Neo goes about his hero's journey. So when we listen to the Bible, and when we talk to the Navajo, and when we talk to Africans, all of whom testify to a spiritual realm that is above us, and that can terrify us, and that can have coercive power over us, well, then, yeah. So, like I said, I over all my journey over the last 2-3 years has not made me appreciate less the reality of angels and demons, but more. That layer of reality has gotten more real, higher definition for me rather than less, but my journey to it has been more philosophical and theological than, let's say, experiential, which you might have if you're a foreign missionary or a Pentecostal who is really, going after demon oppression and possession and spiritual warfare and all these kinds of things. So, yeah, Richard, there's your first question. Second question, work as punishment and work as meaningful activity. that brings order to one's life. That gets into this this area of, again, Chesterton, when he notes, we have this, it's our conscience, it's meaning as an internal gyroscope that Jordan Peterson, nicely laid out. It work is meaningful. And again, listen to now I have to post it. Listen to the question and answer last night from the Eastern Hemisphere. We are built, it's, and again, I'm listening to Rafe Kelly and play. Work gets at some of this. Play gets at some of this. Most of us know that if we are fortunate enough to be able to play at our work, which I'm doing right now, this is sort of office hours, and here I am holding office hours with you all. It's got to be somewhere between work and play. So maybe it's a superposition. Maybe it's the synthesis of work and play that our hearts long for as we're upping the resolution on these things. Now, the first paying job I ever had for something other than a church, when I got my working papers at 16 in New Jersey, was for a baker. And he, of course, was Christian Reformed because my father had connections in the community. My father always found me my jobs. And I cleaned up in a bakery. And one of the first conversations, I seldom saw the baker because he would come in early in the morning and he would do all the baking, and then he would go home at noon or 2 whenever he finished with his work, and go to bed early and everything, because that was the cycle of a baker. And I would come in after school and I would clean up the bakery so it would be ready. He leaves a mess and I come in and do all the cleaning, and he comes to his bakery in the morning and it's all cleaned and set right for him, and he leaves notes as to what things need to be refilled, and I always reset the bakery for him for his work. And one of the early conversations I had with him, I didn't have many conversations with him, I barely ever saw the guy, but was about this point. Well, is work a punishment? And it's so funny because I'm here, this high school student, and here's this, he was near retirement. Here's this 60-plus-year-old guy who's telling me that work is the curse given in the garden. And I started to debate him theologically, snot-nosed kid. Well, is it really? Because when you look at yesterday I got a question about being a gardener and the gardener language. When you look at the when you look at what Adam and Eve are given to do before the fall, it kind of looks like work. It kind of looks like play. And so what's interesting about Genesis 3 is that the sweat of the brow and the weeds of the field are the language in Hebrew in Genesis between the man's curse and the woman's curse is directly parallel. And it's quite clear that in that cultural frame, the man's productive venue is the field, and the woman's productive venue is the womb. The man's superpower is agriculture. The woman's superpower is bringing life into this world, meaning human beings. The man might bring wheat and goats and calves into the world, but the woman brings image bearers. And their power to do this is now limited. So again, back to the first question. Limited by God. And it's only going to be with frustration, that Hebrew word that we try to translate. It's frustration, and that gets played out with the sweat of the brow and pain in childbirth. The sweat of the brow on the man as he brings forth grain from the field. The sweat of the brow on the woman as she brings forth the next generation into our world. So Yeah, it's both. It's both. And so the word we want, so I often think about, okay, what will we be doing in creation 2.0? Will we be working or playing? Will we be work playing and play working? We'll be doing it. And again, I don't know how God will do this. And this is the reason that all of the Good Place and Upload and all of these attempts that we have to imagine the life of the age to come fall short, because God's going to somehow, it's going to need to be more meaningful and glorious than this. But how will God do that without many of the tools that he's using here and now? Many of those being frustration. And so in that sense, the curse, C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world, which is an audacious thing to say for a man who survived the trenches of World War I. And some people, commenters on Lewis, really hate that saying. But in a sense, what happens in Genesis 3 with the curses, that, now the man and the woman themselves aren't cursed. That's important to notice, that the womb is cursed and the field is cursed, again in parallel. But God, in a sense, even with these curses, says, even these curses will point to me. And so this could potentially be an avenue of fruitful exploration when we look at the question of natural evil. That so Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee in the boat, and the storm comes up, and the disciples are freaking out, and Jesus is doing what again in the front of the boat? He's sleeping. And then the disciples wake him up, and don't you care if we live or die? And Jesus is genuinely vexed. That's the better word. He's vexed at the disciples. Oh, you of little faith. And perhaps part of what Jesus is pointing to is, can't you see your maker in the storm? We do. When there's a storm coming, some of us run into the basement, and some of us get our video cameras and say, where's the tornado? I want to see it. Usually if you've ridden out a hurricane, those I know who have had to ride out hurricanes, they're the first ones to flee when another one comes, because do you really want to see that face of God? But there's something of God's face in the hurricane. So, and I think that gets into the work-play thing. So, great questions, Richard, and good colonizing there to sneak them both in.
Okay, I guess we'll open it up to people from the chat who might have questions in the voice chat. Okay, nobody? I'll move on to the next asked question. This question is from Ike2, Electric Boogaloo, my favorite name. My tradition classifies sin in two categories. One, personal sin, deliberate and willful. And two, original depravity, sinful but not consciously willful. There's a lot of talk about systemic sin, particularly in relation to systemic racism. Does systemic sin nest neatly in one or both of the existing categories? Or do parts of it spill into a third category? This may seem like a dry theological point, but my church is really struggling with some of the downstream consequences of this debate. And note I won't be able to attend the live chat. Please skip my question. Only live attendee questions are accepted. That's fine.
Great question. That is not a dry theological debate. That is exactly the debate that churches are having now. And that is an absolutely helpful distinction, and it is theologically correct. It's in some ways expressed in the King James Bible with this word transgressions, although in terms of biblical language, it's even more complex than that. And this again is why I get in trouble with both sides, because on one side I look at critical theory and see, yeah, you've got original depravity right there, and you've got the sins that get into. So people ask me, do you believe in systemic racism? Yes. Every system we create will have sin in it. Can't help it. That's the problem of sin. Now, is it always willful? No. Or deliberate? No. The conversation that we were having. Oh, this was a conversation over. This is a conversation over on the Portal Discord when I snuck in there a couple days ago. They were arguing whether or how important would it be if the COVID-19 virus was man-made or not. Now, it seems there's of course, Brett Weinstein is having this big conversation on his channel about was it man-made or not. And that was the context of that conversation in that voice chat on the Portal Discord. And one person was saying, does it really matter? Nobody is really asserting an intentional release of that, but rather an accidental release. So what if it is, this would be an example of systemic sin. And systemic racism is the fact that, well, it's obvious to see in ways that it's obvious. So I was talking to one of my friends yesterday, and he was talking about, historians are trying to go all the way back to the first moment where, an African indentured servant was made servant for life in perpetuity, as opposed to a non-African indentured servant having a limited term sentence. So, and then it gets into the system. And this is, all of Jordan Peterson's talk about, female selectivity in terms of shaping human evolution. Well, it gets into the system. These things get into the system all the time. So, yes, systemic system. But just recognizing that there's such a thing as systemic racism does not necessarily lead to the prescriptions that critical theory imagines it can do. I think just because you realize that chemicals have power doesn't mean that you are, the Lord of chemistry. And so often I find so much of their ideas, again, they can be very helpful descriptively in showing us our sin, but when it comes to their power to actually address such sin, they're just the same kind of plotters that we have all over the place. You're going to take this thing on directly. Well, I think this shows a lot of people who haven't seriously wrestled with their own sin. And to me, it's always parallel to when you can acknowledge your depravity, Well, good. That's a helpful first step, and it's like the first step of AA. No, yeah, your life has become unworkable because of alcohol. Good. What's next? Well, usually the addict has tried all of that stuff before he's ready to turn his life over to a higher power. Maybe with the bowing in the street, some people are getting to that point, but they don't read enough history to know that the tyranny, almost all tyrannies are attempt to address some systemic sin. That's an old thing. So, no, I think systemic sin very much. Well, the thing is, this is a distinction that is a tremendously helpful categorical distinction, but in real life it's always tied into each other, which again leads to the great irony that many people have pointed out that in the name of third wave anti-racism, they are in fact getting extremely racist. So, and this is exactly the point Paul makes in Galatians 6, where Paul says, Has your brother fallen into sin? Be gentle in restoring, lest you fall. And a lot of exegetes go back and forth on this. Unless you fall into, basically, his own sin. And so I think in many ways what we're seeing with third wave anti-racism is, well, they're not gentle. And so they're falling themselves back into the sin of racism. And that's what we're seeing. And so, yeah, churches, people come to me and say, Paul, don't you see the racism? Oh, I sure do. I've seen it all my life. And I can tell you story after story after story after story after story of the racism that continues to exist. Well, what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to do about it. I'm not going to get tyrannical about it. Because especially with the getting Jim Crow out of the law was far easier than getting racism out of the heart. But part of what Dr. King's genius is he recognized that you had to do both. But the path to doing both was cruciform, which is what the church marches were about in the South. And it's what the cross is about. And for people to say, I see sin, I'm going to go kill it. Yeah, well, why don't you go to Al-Anon and talk to a bunch of spouses of alcoholics and talk to them about what they've learned. Yeah, you go ahead and hide the bottle. You go ahead and browbeat. You go ahead and do all that stuff, and you see if that really helps your loved one. So, yeah, great question.
Oh, I see that Job has popped into the chat, and his question was queued up for first, so go ahead and ask his question. Question from Job.
Yep.
Paul, how do you relate to the idea of angelic and demonic forces, angels, demons, devils? How does it relate to your own porous or buffered self?
Right. Again, I'm trying to systematize these questions and answers so I can make them more accessible for YouTube. I dealt with this a bit in a previous question today, quite a bit, and so Job might have missed it, and so Job, you'll want to go back and listen to the recording, and now I really do have to post the recording. As I said before, the way I can fit angels and demons into a highly secularized worldview, and my worldview has been deeply secularized because of when and where I was born and the education that I've had and the people I talk to, has has grown over the last 2 years. But it has not. I mean, when I first talked to Jonathan Peugeot about this, I wasn't understanding him, and the misunderstanding of Peugeot was not uncommon, because I hear others continuing to misunderstand him on this score, because he will lay out how angels and demons fit into the symbolic language, and then because of our modernist habits, we then begin to hear him as a modernist, because he is finding space for them in the modernist frame. And so then we think, well, they're just telling us a subtraction story, and all principalities and powers are merely like Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, which is a principality and power that we have had a big hand in creating, just like the first graduating class of C.K. McClatchy High in Sacramento, the McClatchy Lions. They had a hand in creating the principality of the school spirit that are the McClatchy Lions. And again, notice how we give it an animal spirit. And as secularists, we hear that and we think, oh, okay, the McClatchy Lions are merely the creation of. Okay, but now right away when you get to that point, you're starting to bump into where Sam Harris fudges. Now you're getting into the intersubjective. Okay, Sam, let's talk about the reality of that intersubjective. And he would say, yeah, but if there was none of the underlying materiality, that intersubjective would not have been created. Yes, that's true. The intersubjective is deeply tied to the materiality. But what you can't say is what then the materiality was subject to. Was subject to past materiality. Okay, that was subject to past materiality. So now we're going to go all the way back to the singularity, and then we're back to Jordan Peterson's quip, and I know it's not original to him. Well, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. So again, we're back to creation. So the rule of the buffered self is that there are no agents above or beyond us who are powerful, meaningful, and so on one hand, you can't live by that rule, because the spirit of the C.K. McClatchy Lions, a high school in that some of my children went to, the spirit of the C.K. McClatchy Lions, well, that's formed my children, some of them that went there. So even in a materialist frame, it's weakening and it's breaking down, which is why Sam Harris will talk about the intersubjective, or Daniel Dennett will talk about information, and I suspect John Vervaeke's work will have more and more atheists becoming non-theists. But again, why would we imagine that there are no more ancient spirits, also creatures? They're on the side of the creator-creature line. And of course, there have been speculations about this. Milton, of course, speculated about it. Many others have. The biblical witness seems to suggest that the angels and demons are older than we are. And again, Tolkien plays with these ideas in his book. These are older than we are, and we are not buffered from them. Modernity, I think, has wrung out a lot of the, wrung out and clarified some of the ways in which human principalities, these younger spirits that we have had a hand in creating, are our children and not older than we are. But again, I kind of like the way the Matrix metaphorized this in the I think again it was the Merovingian, who, these are older programs, the Keymaker, the Oracle, the Architect. The difficulty that you have in watching the Matrix is that you begin to imagine that the Oracle and the Architect are God. No, they're those mighty ones who do his bidding that you bump into in the Old Testament. They're older programs who are functioning. Now we come along and we think our age is so hubristic. We know better. I mean, modernity is so bratty. We know better. We know for sure. Oh my goodness. How do you know? Okay, run the simulation image. How do you know we're the first whack at this? How do you know those older programs, God doesn't use off-the-shelf parts when he's doing his work/play? So that's just sort of my thinking of that on the moment, and these questions always shape my thinking, because the questions are opportunities for more thought. So great question.
Okay. So I guess if anyone has a question from the voice chat, now would be a good time.
I have a question.
Right.
First off, Paul, thank you for all the work you do. Another question would be, in the fill in the gaps, the God of the gaps theory, where people say the Bible is just God, is Christians' way of using God to explain natural events. I say no, it's not people using God to explain natural events, but rather giving purpose to these events. An example would be, you bring up the tsunami that happened on New Year's, and I find a lot of times in the Old Testament, when things happen, it's these natural disasters. It's when they address them, it's not explaining them, but giving them purpose. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and that's why I love these sessions. You guys turn on so many lights for me. It's so helpful. I think that's exactly right. Because so you take out one eye, so you can have a monarchical vision, so you can try and see through the scientific image to the world. So you take out purpose. It's so and Jordan Peterson pointed this out. And once you see it, it's so utterly laughable. And it does invite you to hubris and pride towards others, because once you see this, so you take out the one eye, which is the manifest image, you try and see through the scientific image to the world, and you say, there's no purpose. And it's like, yeah, you just took purpose out. It's like the only tea you ever drank was sweet tea, and then you decide you're going to make tea without sugar, and you taste the tea and say, there's no sugar, and you go all around the world declaring with this cup of tea how there's no sugar in it, and you erect an entire world around the lack of sugar in this tea, and the person who was there when you first did it says, yeah, I saw you. Wasn't that the point of the tea? That you didn't put any sugar in it? So I think your observation is dead on right. So when we see a tsunami, well, and when you look at, okay, so you've got the man born blind in Gospel of John chapter 9. So there's this man born blind. Oh. And this shows that these questions are not new. Our forms are a little bit new. It's new to us in some ways, but these questions are not new. Who sinned, this man or his mother? And, it would not have been... Jesus was... the times we see Jesus really get impatient with his disciples, the closer you read the text, the more you realize how patient he was so often. Because when the disciples asked that question, Jesus could have said, haven't you read the book of Job? Isn't this in the book of Job? Come on! But who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus said, neither. Which, okay, all of the materialists breathe a sigh. Oh, Jesus, okay. But then he goes on to say, no, this is so basically that God would be revealed. Well, your question, you basically said exactly that same thing, that these things are opportunities for the glory of God to be revealed. And then we say, whoa, wait a minute, this is going to be a tragedy, yeah? But again, I know no saint that hasn't tasted tragedy. And so, I told the story recently too, where a woman who became a Christian in a Pentecostal church started coming to my church. And of course, I was raised on the Heidelberg Catechism. And somebody said in the comment, of course you were raised on the Heidelberg Catechism. You say it so fast, I've never known what you've said. So, okay. I was raised on the Heidelberg Catechism, which has these stories of fat years and lean years. And so, again, this gets back to Brett Sockold, God in the System, Bishop Barron, and Governor Cuomo, all of these things. It gets back to the curse of the field that doesn't yield its fruit willingly, and the womb that doesn't yield its fruit without frustration. And it gets into the last chapters of C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, of the miracles of the new creation, where, well, what if our relationship with the Father were not, what if we didn't rebel and therefore creation rebelled against us? Once we are fully restored to the Father and creation is fully restored, our relationship with creation is fully restored as well, where we have dominion, but the kind of dominion we have over the creation is the kind of loving dominion that the father has over his children, or the master has over his dog, and where the master glorifies in the specific pleasure of the inferior of the dog, and gets the dog ready for show, or gets the dog ready for hunt. And when that dog in the hunt streaks out across the field in order to find and retrieve whatever the quail or what have you, that the glory revealed in the boundless enthusiasm of that retriever springing out over the field, and we see it, that this song develops between, the song of glory develops. Well, that's the thing we're looking for. So, yeah, that's we're giving purpose to these events. That's so tremendous. Thank you so much for that. You've really blessed me by that.
Okay, so I guess we'll move on to one of the printed questions in the chat.
Yep.
Question from Aaron. Hi, Paul. Sorry about the mic yesterday. I'm still new to Discord Lite. Thanks for taking the time for these Q&A sessions. A while back, you stated a preference for the term universal truth as opposed to objective. I think I see the disadvantage of the term objective in that it brings to mind Sam Harris's world of Amazon boxes waiting to be manipulated. But what opportunities do you see in describing truth as universal, and how does it avoid the modernist pitfalls of the term objective? Thanks again.
The language sin of our use of the word objective in the way that you just described is exactly the same point of seeing through the scientific image. And it's the sin of saying that world is first, that world is primary, and there's a firstness and a primariness to that world in many ways. And so it's our error, our systemic sin of that is understandable. But what we don't see, and okay, so why do we keep falling for that systemic sin? Well, that's deeply in the manifest image. And it's what Jordan Peterson noticed is that first we see meaning, first we see opportunity and obstacle. And so our hungry hearts are filled with avarice when we see the power that this neat little trick of the scientific method affords, and well, then it's just a social game because we say, I can do this better than you. And lots of people can do it better than lots of other people. And so then it just again becomes another tool of oppression. See, so here's another funny thing. So the critical theorists that say science is a tool of oppression, they're not wholly wrong. They're not wholly wrong in that. Now to call it racism, that's just mislabeling. But their critique has a point. And so, take the point. And I think the point can be corrected by saying, well, the scientific image is nested in the manifest image, and it has to be so for human beings because we are persons. We are manifest. And the scientific image is something that we can do with much discipline, but it doesn't come natural to us. So, and objective is connected to the monarchical vision, and and this again gets back to where Peugeot went with Mercury and Andrea, that we're getting to the end of our corporate delusion on these scores. Now, we're getting to the end of it. Yeah, it might take a couple hundred more years. But Peugeot was right. Once you bring consciousness back into the system, you begin to see that the scientific image is a trick we do. It's a powerful trick. But it's a trick we play. But it's a trick we are playing. And this, again, is philosophically comes back around and around and again. We forgot the subject. We forgot that we are subjects seeing the object. So, yep. Great question.
Okay. I guess maybe take some questions from the voice chat if anyone has some.
I've got one.
All right.
Recently, I've been pouring through the idea of myths and things. Oh. Sorry. Recently, I've been pouring through the idea of myths.
Yeah.
And not myths, but mysticism. Because I talked to Mercury, and he really gets into it like wholeheartedly. And on the other hand, I heard people say, okay, be really careful with mysticism. And it's like, I understand both sides of that argument, but I searched. I was like, okay, non-heretical mysticism, and so I just got this list of Christian mystics, and that pointed to a book called Protestant Mysticism, and I've started reading that, and I was wondering, it might be a word that fudge, mysticism itself, but I was wondering what you see as like good functional mysticism for the modern era.
Well, I'll go back to Chariots of Fire and Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell was this child of missionaries who himself became a missionary to China. He was a sprinter, and so there's that great line, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. When This is where it connects into like flow states and all of the Vervaeke stuff. Why are Christians so surprised that we find the handiwork of God in psychology and biology and economics and sociology? Now, yeah, there's tensions in there, but the scientific revolution began because Christians, well, they were looking for power too, and in that sense, the alchemy, but they're looking for God. Mysticism is a way of looking for God experientially. Again, I was thinking about the dude who was meditating while all of us were watching the news about the pandemic, and on one hand, if you take a step back and ask yourself in a very secularish way, what's he doing with meditating? And a lot of the people on the Vervaeke side of this conversation, it's very self-conscious. Well, if consciousness was taken out of the system in order to achieve the scientific image, what if we look at consciousness? Well, isn't having a ritual and a routine for 75 days sort of looking at consciousness? Now, what's funny about some of these things is that and Vervaeke again is right on this stuff, is we're always cheating. So I take a psychedelic and I take a psychedelic drug and I have this mystical experience, and I think Peterson got that right. Yeah, you're kind of taking a chemical shortcut. It's sort of like, I could stand to lose another 20 pounds, especially during COVID now. There are some, there are drugs that are very effective in giving me to suppress my appetite. They're basically uppers. They're basically amphetamines. And I will eat less, and I will have more energy, and I'll feel like I'm clearer, and I'll lose weight, and yeah, I can do that. But should I? And doctors will say, yeah, but it's coming at a cost. In a sense, you're cheating. And if you'd actually be a little bit more disciplined about your diet and exercise, you would not only have the direct benefits of losing weight and the medical benefits of that, but you would also have the spiritual benefits of having a little bit more self-control, having a little bit more agency in your life, etc., etc. So, the fact that what we call mysticism is common across the spiritual, across the religious spectrum, shouldn't surprise us, just like acetaminophen working across the religious spectrum shouldn't surprise us. And this, again, we get back into, again, Brett Sockold, God Within the System, back into Bishop Barron. The natural, supernatural distinction, again, like almost every model, it's helpful, but it's concurrently, it's so muddied and fudgy. That's part of my issue with that distinction. So, yeah, mysticism is real, and Lectio Divina, Desert Fathers, there's a rich tradition of Christian mysticism. That shouldn't surprise us any less than a rich tradition of Christian scientists. It's part of life.
So I guess I'll move on to the next question in the chat. Brave Wall 858 asks, is race ethnicity a part of one's identity that should be valued, i.e. as a point of pride, brotherhood, community, etc.? Or should it be regarded as no different from height or blood type? I'm inclined to the latter, but this question is complicated by the existence of communities which are very much defined by their racial identity for very understandable reasons.
There's a certain arbitrary nature to looking at skin color in terms of identity. I mean, and I think that it's not hard to see. It's so funny because blood type, we recently discovered that my blood type's A positive, my sister's was A positive, my wife's was A positive, and so being the biological ignoramus that I am, I told my kids, I think you're probably all A positive in terms of your blood type. And one of my sons gave blood and went to the blood bank, and of course they're not just simply going to take your word for your blood type, but they test your blood type, and he was O positive. And I was having a conversation with my mother this week, and I mentioned that to her because I knew that she had mentioned, because of the COVID thing, there's talk about blood types and how my mother is O negative. She's a universal donor. And I said, oh, you're going to love to hear this, Mom. Benny's type O blood. And, part of my genetics snuck through to the grandchildren. And there's always this little game of, this little identity game. There's a photograph of on my mother's side, my great-grandfather when he was young. And he is the spitting image of one of my cousins. And this cousin, in a family, you might see 2 or 3 siblings that sort of look alike, and so you get a picture of the family. Then there's some outlier in the family that, he's a biological child, but he looks a little different. Well, my cousin is kind of an outlier. He's got all this curly hair, and I saw this picture of my great-great-grandfather, and it's like, that's my cousin George, because the picture was of my great-great-grandfather at a younger point in his life when I knew my cousin George, when my cousin George was that age. And it was like, wow. So, okay, point of pride, brotherhood, community. There's something fun about my son and my mother being in the type O club in the Vanderclay family. And, a bunch of A positives around, but they're going to celebrate their type O-ness. As I mentioned in the video I recently did, skin color is such a deceptive way it's such a enticing way to start to separate people. And even before we have the kinds of racism that we do, we're going to find ways of differentiating and distinguishing each other. We do it with beauty, we do it with height, we do it with physical strength, we do it with, all kinds of different things. It's not, and the fact that in the American South, when the mosquito came over with the Europeans and they discovered tobacco, and tobacco was new to the world. You know, it's so funny. Everybody's ripping down Columbus statues, and it's like, what's really funny is that globalists are ripping down statues to the father of globalism, because Christopher Columbus really is the father of globalism, and kind of unwittingly, but not so unwittingly. But globalists are against the nationalists, and they're ripping down the statue of their father. They don't know too much. So anyway, that West Africans with immunity to certain strains of malaria would outcompete the white indentured servants that just kept dying in the tobacco fields of colonial America. Well, now you have a recipe for skin color, and the fact that there is now an economic motivation there's an economic motivation. The Africans would have a social weakness. The fact that all of this would combine into marking people separate by skin color, that's not arbitrary. It's rational. And the fact that this would bear such bitter fruit over centuries of practice and reinforcement and variations upon that. So should I feel pride that I am tall like my father? And in my family, we have the short club and the tall club. So one of my sons is exactly my height, and my two other sons, I think, especially my oldest son, gosh, because he was a good basketball player, and he's about 6'1". But those extra 3-4 inches, boy, they would have made him powerful on the court, and he didn't have them. And my second son wasn't so much into basketball, got onto varsity earlier because of his height. Really isn't as good at... Oh boy, if they hear this video, I'm going to get in trouble. The older one really is a little better basketball player than the second one. And part of it was he worked at it so much and he loved it, and so on and so forth. But so we have the tall club and the short club, and in our family it's good-natured mostly, because every now and then the shorts do take on sort of a victim culture, and the talls very much take on a sort of a pride about our height. But then again, when it comes to reaching things on high shelves, the tall club gets to lord it over the short club. But when we go on an airplane ride to Australia, the shorts are moving around their legs, happily so, and we tall people are in misery. So this is what we do as people. And it can get very cruel, such as with racism.
All right. I guess it's maybe time to take a question from the voice chat, if anyone has one. Okay. So we can move on to a question from the text chat. Michael C. asks, can we replace privilege talk with blessing/blessed talk? What would be gained? What would be lost?
It's a good question. I think blessing maps fairly well onto privilege. Secularity is going to chafe at blessing, because blessing so implies a giver, and you're going to trigger a lot of people who are allergic to Calvinism out there, because there's a sense of a divine hand picking and choosing. Calvinists are less allergic to that kind of thinking, but in that spectrum, so now you're not only, it's so interesting the way we want to depersonalize God in order to manage the relationship from below. So now you're going to tell me not only that that the privileged position of superiority in the culture is not only an accident of history, again, watch the language, but also a purposeful element from the author of history. Oh, that's really gonna, the egalitarians are really gonna struggle under that. So on one hand, but again, you're right. What could be gained? Well, the idea that, well, maybe if you can hold on to a loving God, then the adversities that I face, and again, there's plenty of biblical and confessional language for this, the adversities that I face are like Paul's thorn in the flesh. And where, okay, Lord, you didn't make me, you didn't give me the biological or social aspects of supremacy in our culture. Is that part of your loving kindness given to me? One of the things that I think about, and you know, again, critical theory, there's a lot there. I mean, in our protestations of its facile adoption, we should at the same time appreciate its insights. So here's the irony. Go ahead and so now what we do is we say, well, there's this sort of historical or systemic privilege that is conferred on people that they have not earned. And so what we're going to try to do to balance this is afford unearned privileges to others who have been systemically and historically disadvantaged. And so listen to Glenn Lowry talk about affirmative action. Okay, so we're going to have two standards for admissions into this college. If you're white, you need this test score. If you're black, we'll let you in with these lower test scores. And on a recent conversation with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, I was tremendously impressed by the honesty of this. He said, you know, I was a product of affirmative action and I was unworthy. But when I finally got to the point of realizing my unworthiness, I got up to speed. Okay? So here's the advantage of the disadvantaged. If they, in fact, can own their disadvantage, they can turn it into an advantage. In other words, look at, you know, I watched some of the last season on ESPN, and when Michael Jordan started college, he had some talent. He had some skills. He was a good basketball player, but am I remembering this correctly? He either didn't make the team or he was riding the pine. He was on the bench. And, well, what did he do? Well, basically he said to the coach, he said, I'm going to be the best basketball player around. And the coach kind of smiled at him and said, you don't live like it. You want to be the best basketball player on this floor? What do you have to do? You got people out there who are taller than you, who are more athletic than you. They have been they have been given gifts that you have not been given. And now we're getting into, in some ways, the other thing that humanity has that the animals don't have. What did Michael? It's will, it's agency, it's group B aspects. That Michael Jordan was going to colonize his body, and he was going to put himself into training. He was going to colonize his spirit, and he was going to be the best basketball player. And he did it. In other words, he took his lack of privilege and turned it into an advantage. And so this privilege, underprivileged talk and this is what a lot of the conservatives like Glenn Lowry have been pointing to, and John McWhorter, the real poison of this system is not necessarily that all its insights are incorrect, but that it's anti-agentic, and it itself is disabling people who could use their lack of privilege to their advantage to truly make themselves and things around them glorious. And so the irony of all of this imagined social justice remedy is that it's actually making the privileged stronger. It's affording the opportunity of the underprivileged to the privileged. And so now that white student who is competing against black students with a handicap, what does that white student now have to do? They have to go out and work harder. They've got to, if they do that, unless they want to just try to marshal all sorts of other cheating and other privileges. So, and this, so there was a question on Brett Weinstein about the Jews, and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. And I thought Brett's answer was really quite good. He said, what have the Jews been doing? Are they biologically superior? He didn't want to make that argument for very real social reasons today. Well, how have they managed to have so much excellence? And he took the culture track. He said, well, guess what they've been doing? There's that great short story of Kurt Vonnegut where, so you've got, what's his name? They put all these weights on him because he's so much bigger and stronger than everyone else. Well, guess what happens when you take the weights off? He's stronger still. And so this, again, is part of the stupidity of so much of this critical theory strategy is you're really making the privileged stronger, And so it's just, again, one of these ironies of reality. So
I guess if anyone has any questions from the voice chat.
We're running out of time, so we should probably take whacks at the written questions, and because I did a Q&A yesterday, and I thought, well, we'll see what happens today. Maybe we will have exhausted the system, but apparently not.
All right, I'll jump into a written question then. So from Andrea with the bangs, follow-up to Shari's question, a little bit complex because she asked it right at the beginning. It was, what constitutes something nudging up against the sacred, both theist and non-theist? And she was asking for Lars. Now, Andrea's question actually is, it does seem like people who do not want to find God keep tripping over him in search for meaning, that bend over backwards to explain these moments away. Why are some so resistant?
Well, that's a very old conversation, and Milton, of course, got into it, and I think, there's some great answers that come to us over time. I think a lot of it comes down to that God is God and we are not. And so look at the 7 deadly sins. They all in some ways can sort of come together. That has to do with our emptiness and his fullness, our smallness and our desire to be larger. So it's envy, and it's pride, and gluttony is trying to fill up my emptiness with food, and lust is trying to fill up my emptiness with sex, and gossip is trying to fill up my reputation by tearing down another's. At some point, we have to make our peace with what we are. And I think in some ways, a deep part of atheism is the complaint about what we are not. And so everybody has a hungry heart. Our hearts are hungry. And Augustine says our hearts remain hungry until they're satisfied with God. Well, what is that? That sounds, again, with our God number 2 diminished visions. Our hearts are hungry until they're satisfied by the author of everything. And if we have God, we have enough. So that's how we are. And the fury of fighting a war you cannot win. That's so painful.
Well, thanks, Paul. There's a couple more questions, but I'm sure we'll get to them in time.
Yeah, no, 2 hours is a good discipline. So, thank you all for coming, and I will, like I said, I'm recording these. Shelley made a good comment about there's value in the unrecorded sessions too, because I can be a little bit more transparent about personal things. Some of you can be more transparent about personal things. So we'll have to keep space for that. I'm still trying to figure out the correct rhythm for these question and answer sessions, how they fit into the larger overall projects. I'm really seeing, just like with the rando conversations, that that there's an important place for this. But trying to get the mechanics right, that's sort of what we're doing with this. So thank you all for being part of the big experiment, and again, continue to give me feedback and let me know if this is helpful, and we'll keep playing with this stuff. So thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Paul.